Okay, let's turn to this very serious issue, which is the warfare passages, especially violence in the Old Testament. We'll come to the Greg Boyd sort of perspective on this in a moment, but for now, Coburn in Tacoma, Washington asks, what are your thoughts on the conquest of Canaan and the instructions from God to his people to kill women and children in the process? I've always struggled to reconcile this, what looks like genocide, with the mission of God's people being to love and serve the world. I'd love to hear how you've wrestled with that and what wider lens, context or perspective you might have on the matter. And John asked the similar question briefly, how do you explain the horrific Old Testament accounts of God's judgment in the light of the New Testament change of emphasis?
Yeah. I wouldn't quite say the New Testament change of emphasis, because that rather implies that what you have right through the Bible is a set of moral examples. And it's quite clear in many parts of the Old Testament that the story is not being told in any way as a moral example, as this is how you ought to do it, guys. Sure. And that, of course, that comes to a low point at the end of the book of Judges with those horrific stories, which one hopes that nobody under the age of 21 would ever read, but I'm sure they do. So it's partly a matter of learning to read the Bible in terms of the whole sweep, and then it isn't a matter of, oh, well, the Old Testament says it's okay to do genocide, and then Jesus says it isn't. It doesn't work like that. And I think all of this comes down to the fact that when God makes the good creation, he calls humans to be his partners in making creation what he wants it to be. And that's kind of built into Genesis 1 and 2. This is a world designed to work when humans are reflecting God's stewardship into the world. When the humans rebel, God doesn't say, oh, well, goodness, now that they've rebelled, we can't have humans involved with my plan. I'll have to do something quite different. God sticks with the original plan, which means that when he calls Abraham as he still is then, God calls somebody who he knows, God knows, and the narrator of Genesis knows, is a very mixed up character. I mean, the story of Abraham oscillates from great moments of faith and obedience to disastrous moments of getting it wrong and cowardice and getting everything upside down, inside out. So faith 1 minute and apparent unbelief the next, and then back to faith the next. And so the idea that Abraham is this great hero of faith, when I was younger, people would give me books on the great men of faith and women of faith in the Old Testament, as though the stories were all simple, going from one heroic thing to another. And you only have to think of David and Solomon and so on to see, no, they're not like that, actually. So that right from the start, God's Israel-shaped plan, the Abraham and onwards plan, if you like, has built into it the fact that odd things are going to happen, which is something which God is eventually going to have to take responsibility for. And that's why I think the Old Testament as it stands remains deeply, deeply ambiguous. And actually, I think it's one of the things Jonathan Sacks was exploring in his book, Not in God's Name, where you get the Isaac and the Ishmael story. And he points out that the Hebrew words that are used are designed to push the reader's sympathy all onto Ishmael, even though we know that Isaac is the one who's going to come out smiling at the end of the day. And likewise with Jacob and Esau. It's as though the writers of Genesis and the other books are saying, this was how it had to be, but there's a deep ambiguity built in, and I think the Canaanite stuff is the most obvious example of that. But then, when you read it from a Christian lens, part of the meaning of the cross of Jesus, it seems to me, is that the four Gospels tell the story as this is how the whole story of Israel and the world gets funneled down onto one point, and it'll only work, you can only understand it if you say this isn't just the story of a first century human being called Jesus. This is the story of God himself taking responsibility because he's made a world in which this was the only way that things could be dealt with. And now he's bearing it all himself. That I find not a comfortable thing, but then the cross is never meant to be a comfortable thing. But it's a way of saying when I see the story whole, and all the multiple tragedies, the Canaanite women, etc., and I see Mary at the foot of the cross, and a sword will pierce her soul also, etc., that there's something whole about that, which then with the resurrection says, and now that's been done, and we are starting a new world. And the book of Acts is not about the church going out with swords and staves to beat everybody up. It's about a different kind of mission entirely.